All right then, hello, willkommen, bienvenue, konnichiwa. It's time for the Honest Inquisition yet again. Episode 306 on Sunday the 26th of November 2023. I'm Phil.
I'm Ben.
I'm Matt.
And tonight we're very happy to be joined for the second time by historian and author Ralph Ellis. How are you doing, Ralph?
Very good. Yes, thanks very much for having me on again. Good to be with you. So, love the intro. I look about 20 years younger on the intro, so there, I approve.
We were just discussing that behind your back when you couldn't hear, because I think I got that from the Daily Telegraph or the Daily Mail or something.
Daily Mail, yes. That was probably about 10 years ago.
Right, okay. I don't think you've aged a day, Ralph.
No, not a day, no.
Now, you came on last summer, I think it was, summer 2022. And we talked about ancient Egyptian history and some biblical connections there between certain figures like Akhenaten and some of the patriarchs from the Old Testament history and that. So this week we were going to talk about the Apostolic era, which I think if you asked a lot of historians, they would say that this period is probably one of the most significant periods in recorded history. Would you agree with that, Ralph?
Oh, yes, very much. Well, it's been very influential. I don't think it was actually that great an incident when it actually happened, but because it became institutionalized into our religious life, it's become hugely influential, of course, for all three religions, of the Abrahamic religions.
Yeah. And I guess the reason you're here is because you have some ideas, you've done some research, written books about this period and come to very different conclusions than what you'll read on Wikipedia or reading a standard history textbook.
Oh, yes, I've been banned from Wikipedia.
Really?
Literally. They threw me off. 12 times, I think, I've been thrown off Wikipedia. Don't tell anyone, but I go back under different names. But yeah, they don't like this information, even though they cannot tear it down very easily because it all comes straight out of the historical records. So I'm just using standard historical data. I'm just putting a slightly different spin on it, a slightly different interpretation. But that interpretation does change things quite dramatically, even though the underlying story remains exactly the same. So same story, different context, basically. And some people find that different context to be challenging, alarming, and they don't like it because it challenges their perceptions of this story and their beliefs and their faith and everything else. And so a lot of people cannot accept it. Protestants, not so much. They don't. I've discussed this with standard C of E priests, and they seem to be relatively open to it because they're fairly broad-minded. But anyone that's slightly more fundamentalist, of course, they just hate it. So I've had various contentions with American fundamentalists, including Mormons, who dislike it intensely. So they've tried canceling me. And Robert Price, I don't know if you know Dr. Robert Price. He does quite a few of these discussions on the New Testament. And they've tried to cancel him as well, all sorts of slanderous accusations, not to defeat someone on the topic, on the discussion, but just to try and cancel them. What they try and do is terrible.
Yeah, that's a common trope, isn't it? If you can't win, if you can't, well, it's like a football saying, isn't it? If you can't beat the player, beat the man or something. How's it go? Play the ball,
play the
not
man,
the man,
not the ball.
Play the ball, not the man.
Yes, that one.
I nearly got there. Yeah, I mean, it's part of the reason for this controversy in that you're dealing with people's belief on the nature of Christ, the nature of Jesus.
Yes, but in some respects, you might say that I'm living their dream because I'm showing them the Jesus, the Christ, as they call him, in the flesh as a real historical character. I've found this guy in the historical record. You would have thought they'd have been jumping up and down and saying, hooray, look, it was all true all along, just as we told you. But they won't do that, because the Jesus I've found is not quite the Jesus they've been believing in. Basically, without getting too far ahead of ourselves, he's a real king, not a pretend king. And that comes down to the crux of this problem is, how can you lose a king from history? So everybody has known about this history for 2,000 years, and they all say that Jesus is a king. He was called a king at his birth. He was called a king at his crucifixion, and on numerous times in between. And yet somehow he's gone missing from the historical record. How do you lose a king? Well, the answer is when someone wants to cancel him. Talking about cancel culture, he was cancelled because he had a dispute with Rome. And if you mix with Rome, Rome's going to delete you from history. And that's what they tried to do, and that's effectively what they did do. Because largely, I think some people knew about this. I think the Knights Templar knew all about this. That was the big secret that they held. That was the big problem that the Catholic Church was afraid of, is that the Knights Templar understood this information. And of course, the Catholic Church didn't want it to come out. But apart from that, for the last 700 years, I don't think anybody has known about this at all. So it's been dead and buried, and nobody has understood this information for 700 years.
Wow. So, I mean, where's a good place to sort of start this narrative then, this alternative narrative that you've developed?
I think the first thing we need to do, I was going to start with trying to introduce Edessa and why Edessa is important to this story, because people won't know what Edessa is. So what I'm going to do first of all is do a quick share screen so we can see where it is. So if I go, dear old Zoom, they have changed the they've changed the screen for sharing. Okay. Yeah, it's got different functions. Okay, so now if I press that one, we should come up with a share screen that should have a map on it.
Okay, bear with me.
Do we have a map?
Got Zoom. Hang on.
There was a map for a minute.
There was, yeah.
There it is.
Yeah, that's not.
You've got it.
That's not,
now, if I make that bigger that way, oh, yep,
no,
I can make it smaller if you want.
No, just stay where you are. You might have, because last time didn't we have to stop sharing and share again?
Well, I can do that. Yes,
so can you try that, please, Ralph?
I can do stop share, and I can go screen share and screen share that page, and that should come up again. Is that looking good?
1 second. I just have to mess with some settings here, I think. Windows 10. There we go. We're getting there. Just need to resize this.
Yeah.
Reset transform. No, fit to screen. Blah, 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 blah.
Enhance.
Enhance, rotate.
There you go.
Magnify.
That looks like we're on the screen. Is that,
yeah,
is that good?
We're there. Yeah, so we've got the map of the Near East here.
Yeah, it's just to spot where we're talking about, because people will be unfamiliar with some of the names and terms we're going to be talking about. So here's a map of the Levant, Mediterranean on the left, obviously, Judea down the bottom on the left. You should be able to see my cursor going round and round. Is that visible? Good. Syria is all that lot where they're having all the problems at present. And if we go to North Syria, that is where the arrow is pointing. That is Edessa. So it's a independent city-state in Mesopotamia, because it's across the Euphrates. The Euphrates is this line here. And it was subservient to Rome, of course, because Rome sort of controlled this area. Now, there's a place over here on the right side called Arbela. That I will be calling Adiabeni. So if you hear Adiabeni, it's way down by Mosul over in Iraq. So it's a long, long way away. But this is the one we're going to talk about most of all. This is Edessa. And this is where I think these people came from for many reasons.
Sorry, Ralph, where's Edessa in modern times? You might have mentioned it.
Sanliurfa, it's called. It's in Anatolia.
Oh, okay.
And it's called Sanliurfa. Not many people know of it.
Turkey, is it not?
Turkey.
In Turkey, yes. I call it Anatolia because that historically that's what it was called.
So I'm geographically
retarded.
Yeah.
Challenged, yes.
Challenged,
in modern Turkey, yes. So it was the first ever Christian city.
Wow.
But of course, if you go there now, there are no Christians there whatsoever.
Is there any Paul letters to the Edessans?
Not to the Edessans, no.
That's interesting.
He was evangelizing across the Mediterranean to the west of modern Turkey and into Greece.
Right.
Any
but
emails?
I think they did go to Edessa, and we'll see that in a minute, but it's been covered up, so you wouldn't know that they were in Edessa. Now, the other place we need to know is down here at the bottom of the map. You will see Petra. We're going to be talking about Petra. That's the Rose Red City, ruled by King Aretas of Petra. And there was a battle here in Perea, which we're going to talk about. So see how far it is from Perea all the way up to Edessa. Now that's going to be important in just 1 minute time. So I will stop sharing there because I think we're finished with that. And I want to come on to John the Baptist because we want to introduce Edessa into this story. And I say that it's been deleted. And you'll see here that it has indeed been deleted. So I presume you're all familiar with John the Baptist getting beheaded and his head being taken on a platter. So John the Baptist, he was the cousin of Jesus, and he made a complaint. So this comes from the Gospels, of course. It's a very famous event in the Gospels, that he challenged this marriage of Herod Antipas. So Herod Antipas was one of the kings of Judea, and he wanted to divorce his wife, Pharsalus, and marry Herodias. And John the Baptist objected to this because he said the marriage was illegal. And for his pains in pointing this out, and probably for some other political reason as well, he got his head cut off. And that caused ramifications within the New Testament story, the beheading of John the Baptist, but also it appears in real history. And a lot of people don't know that because most of the New Testament is divorced from real history. But other people do talk about the beheading of John the Baptist. And one of those is Josephus Flavius, who is Judaism's greatest historian. He was a historian in the sort of late 1st century. He wrote all of the history of the Jews and then the history of the Jewish revolt. And he's largely regarded as being historical rather than fictional. So we tend to believe what he says. So anyway, Josephus also talks about this beheading, which is interesting because we have a historical account of this. And Josephus says, Aretas, he was the king of Petra, remember, down in southern Jordan. Aretas made war between him and Herod Antipas and raised armies on both sides and prepared for war. This would have been in AD 35, something like that. And when they joined battle, all of Herod's army was destroyed by the treachery of some fugitives from the tetrarchy of Philip, i.e. from Syria, who joined with Aretas's army in order to defeat Herod Antipas. So there was a battle. Why was the battle? Well, because the daughter of King Aretas had just been sent home. Herod Antipas had divorced her and sent her back to Petra. So the king of Petra was not terribly amused by this. and he sent his army up to punish Herod Antipas. But he was joined by some fugitives. So immediately you know that something is wrong here, because Josephus knows everything that happened in the first century in Judea. So why is he not giving us the name of these auxiliary forces who joined with Aretas? He's calling them fugitives, treachery, no less, of some fugitives. Well, it's because he has a bias, just like all of the news reports today, where, the BBC has this stupendously left-wing bias, as does CNN and various other things. Well, Josephus Flavius had his wonderfully Roman bias, and he did what the Romans said because they were his paymasters. And if he didn't do it, they would probably cut his head off or something. So Josephus is giving us the Roman version of this. But if we go across to Moses of Corene, who is a historian from Syria, from Mesopotamia, he's a little bit later, but he gives us exactly the same story with a difference. So Moses of Corene says, King Abgarus, now there's a new name before you. He was the king of Edessa, so we've already arrived at Edessa. So he says, King Abgarus allied himself with King Aretas of Petra and gave him some auxiliary troops to make war upon Herod Antipas. This is the same account of the same events. Being sharply attacked, Herod's troops were defeated thanks to the help of the brave Edessans. As if by divine providence, vengeance was taken for the death of John the Baptist. Wow. Interesting. Now we have a different viewpoint. If you're going to overcome a bias, you need 2 or 3 viewpoints. It's the only way to overcome it. And now we know who those fugitives were that Josephus was talking about. That was the Edessan army. And that's interesting on many topics, because the Edessan army came from a long way away. We've already seen how far it was. They came a long way to join with this battle. Now, why were they there? Well, no, before we get to that, we can also see that Josephus Flavius has his bias. He won't tell us who these people were. He calls them fugitives. Why is he doing that? Well, because he was ordered by Rome, his paymasters, never to mention Edessa, even though it was a very influential monarchy in this era, in this region. Their monarchs became the kings and queens of Judea in the first century, which not many people know about. And yet you go through the works of Josephus, and he never mentions the Edessan monarchy once. And he never, ever mentions Edessa either. So there has been a cover-up. But because we've got this second version of this same story, we now know who they were. This was the Edessans. But why were the Edessans down in Judea or Jordan having this battle? Well, it says here, it was as if by divine providence that vengeance was taken for the death of John the Baptist. The only other reason, Petra was angry because his daughter had been sent home again. Yeah. And so why were the Edessans down there? The only other thing that happened at this time was the death of John the Baptist. And it says that they were there essentially to take vengeance for the death of John the Baptist, which rather infers that John the Baptist belonged to the Edessan monarchy.
Yes, through his mother,
otherwise,
I guess.
Yeah, why would they be down there? And that's exactly what Moses of Corene is saying. It was vengeance for the death of John the Baptist. But that means John the Baptist was a prince or a priest of Edessa. So suddenly we've introduced, even at this first stage with one paragraph, we've introduced Edessa into the gospel story. That one of the main characters in the gospel story, John the Baptist, was a prince of Edessa. That is how close Edessa is to this story. And of course, who knows about that? Who knows that John the Baptist was an Edessan prince? Nobody. And that's the problem, that the story has been changed, so that a lot of this is being covered up.
Some of the Ralph, some of the alternate history authors would say that Jesus and John were part of this group called the Essenes.
Yes, they probably were. So the Essenes lived. It was like a monastic community. I say they were probably actually a yeshiva, which is a Jewish boarding school, because education was always very strong within the Jewish community. And they had these boarding schools where you sent your sons away to the school. When I went to Qumran, and I've been there a few times, they've even got some desks still remaining. I could not sit on the desks. They were microscopic. So either they were very small people, or perhaps it was a school, it was a yeshiva. But at the very least, it was a monastery. But the Edessans, it's down on the shores of the Dead Sea. The Edessans were known as the sons of Zadok. And the second in command of these people who founded Edessa was called Zadok. So I think there is a direct link there between the Essenes and the royal family of Edessa, because the royal family of Edessa were Jewish. We'll go on to that in a minute. They were proselyte Jews, so they were converts to Judaism. But they were Nazarene Jews, the same sect as Jesus. Jesus was a Nazarene. But they were slightly separate because the Nazarene means to separate. So we could sort of infer that they were like monks in a monastery, separating themselves off. And they didn't cut their hair, which is why Jesus has always got long hair and beard, because the Edessans never cut their hair.
Right. And Zadok is the importance of Zadok. Something's ringing in my head that Zadok was one of the names of one of the high priests, the Jewish high priests going back.
Zadok the priest, yeah, that's where the name comes from. Right. And Nathan crowned King Solomon. They even played that at the coronation of Charlie Boy, Big Ears.
Zadok, yeah.
Yeah, Zadok the priest and Nathan. Yeah, it's an old.
We prefer to call him Lord Sausage Fingers on this podcast.
Yes, I've seen that. But Zadok, if I remember correctly, Zadok just means justice.
Right.
So this is a name, because we get the two languages, and so you get these names in two different languages. And so the brother of Jesus was called Zadok, James Justus.
James the Just, right.
James the Just. Yeah. So he was James Zadok. So this was a common name amongst these people. Yeah, wheels within wheels.
Yeah.
So we can do this again. So we've introduced Edessa is something to do with the New Testament story. But we can do this again and again. You read these passages. Even if you're a devout Christian, you read these passages and they mean nothing to you. Just like the John the Baptist passage would mean nothing to you unless you had read the Syriac historians as well. And this comes out of Acts 11:28, which is about the famine. So it says, Agabus stood up and signified there would be a great famine throughout the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. It's probably about AD 50, something like that. And the disciples determined, so this is the disciples of Jesus, we know we're right in the center of the New Testament here. The disciples determined to send famine relief money to their brethren that lived in Judea, which they did so, and they sent it by the hands of Saul and Barnabas. So that doesn't mean a great deal unless you know the history of this region. because this famine relief money is very famous. We've got lots of mentions of it. And the famine relief money was given by Queen Helena of the Adiabeni. Lots of new names here, but this is the history of the region that's not taught, but should be taught as a part of the New Testament story. So Queen Helena, she's from the beginning of the 1st century. She probably died in about AD 60 or something. She became the Queen of the Jews in AD 50. And people won't know that. She had the largest palace and the largest tomb in Jerusalem. And she became a Nazarene Jew. The Talmud tells us this. So the Talmud is the book of law, really, from Jewish religion. And she became a Nazarene Jew, the same sect as Jesus. And she became the Queen of the Jews in about AD 50. And it was she that sent the famine relief money down to Judea. This is a very famous event. Lots of people write about this. So here in the New Testament, in Acts of the Apostles, we have a similar story, but it's Agabus who's sending the money down to Judea. So what's the connection? Well, Agabus is King Abgarus of Edessa. So he does get a mention here. They've changed the name slightly. We'll go through that in a minute. But so what's the connection here between the king of Edessa and the queen of Adiabeni? Adiabeni was that place I showed you over by Mosul, quite a long way away to the west, to the east, which I don't think exists. And we've got good reason for thinking that, because we have, from the Syriac historians, they say that Queen Helena was married to King Abgarus of Edessa. So she was the queen of Edessa. Right, we're back into Edessa again already. Second paragraph, and we're back into Edessa already.
And if sorry to interrupt, Ralph. If she was from the place near Mosul, wouldn't that fall in the Parthian side of the divide?
That's the problem with it.
Yeah, how would she get into?
It seems
Judea.
unlikely, and there is no archaeological evidence for Adiabeni whatsoever. I think it's a distraction. It's a pseudonym that's been made up by Josephus Flavius, because it's really Josephus Flavius that mentions this place. Remember that Josephus Flavius could not mention Edessa. He was banned from doing so by the Romans. And so he made up this name, Adiabeni, right, which people have assumed is linked to Arbela, which is near to Mosul. I don't think that place exists. And the fact that we have this information that she was married to the king of Edessa, I think means that she was probably actually an Edessan queen. And so that would make sense, because she's the one that sent the famine relief money. And now in Acts of the Apostles, it's King Abgarus, who is her husband, who is sending the famine relief money. That's where the money came from. It came from Edessa. Now, the interesting thing about this is that money was sent down to Jerusalem by Saul and Barnabas. Saul is St. Paul, the guy who wrote most of the New Testament. So Saul must have been an ambassador of the Edessan monarchy. So again, 2 paragraphs, and Edessa is at the center of the New Testament story. Saul, the guy who created Christianity, because of course Christianity has nothing to do with Jesus. I like putting that one out, because people are astounded by it. But if you've ever read the New Testament, you'll know this. There were 2 churches at this time. There was the Church of Jesus and James, which was a Judaic, Nazarene Judaic church. And then there was the simple Judaism of Saul. Saul had been out on his first evangelical tour across the Mediterranean, and he had been teaching sort of Nazarene doctrine, and he hadn't been well received. And so at the Council of Jerusalem, he went to James, the brother of Jesus, and said, look, can I preach to the Gentiles? Because they seem to like this stuff. And James said yes. He said, yeah, off you go, son, because he was only young. He said, yeah, these are the rules of simple Judaism for Gentiles. And they were, don't eat meat that had been sacrificed to idols, don't drink blood, don't eat strangled animals because they still had the blood in them, and don't indulge in fornication. And
I'm
he
out.
probably means
That's a deal breaker.
yeah, sorry, you're all out there. I think he means incest by that, because there was a lot of incest running around at that time.
I know I was talking about the blood.
Right. No black pudding. Sorry, it's off. Traditional breakfast has gone, I'm afraid. Those were the 4 rules of simple Judaism for Gentiles, and Saul went off across the Mediterranean on his second evangelical tour, mainly preaching to the Gentiles. And he built up his own Gentile church. He became the apostle to the Gentiles, as he calls himself. And his church, because he had as many adherents as he possibly could get, you know, the church of Jesus and James was only preaching to Jews.
Jerusalem.
So he had a very limited audience, whereas Saul could go to anyone and say, do you want to join? You know, as long as you put a few shekels in the collecting plate, you're in. And his church became more powerful than the church of Jesus and James. And eventually he defeated, because of the Jewish revolt and various other things, he defeated them. And his church was the winner in this little religious battle, and his church became Christianity.
Right, yeah.
While
because,
the church of, yeah.
Yeah, because James was based in Jerusalem and Paul went to Rome, and that was the heart of the empire.
Yes, he did. He went to see Nero. So, yeah, he won that battle, and Christianity is the church of Saul, not the church of Jesus. So anyone who is believing in Christianity is believing in the enemy of Jesus. So, yeah, they're on the wrong side, really.
Is it too late to give out a trigger warning?
It's the old switcheroo.
Christians.
Yeah, you might need to put it in the subtitles maybe or something. Yeah, it gets a bit like that. But I mean, that's what Acts of the Apostles says. I mean, even the first time I read it, I understood that that's what Acts of the Apostles was saying. It's pretty obvious, but people gloss over that because it interferes with their faith, of course. So they don't want to know about it.
That's the point, Ralph. You mentioned before that Paul wrote most of the New Testament.
Yeah.
I'm guessing most mainstream New Testament scholars would disagree with that.
Oh, no, he wrote all of the epistles.
Oh, the epistles,
some of the,
right. But I mean, Acts, for example, like most traditional scholarship would say that Acts was written by Luke, the same author as Luke.
Yeah, but Luke is Sauline as well. It's been well known that Acts of the Apostles and Luke have been heavily influenced by Saul. Remember, a lot of Acts is the I. There's this big I section where it appears to be Saul actually speaking himself. Yeah, it's been well known that Luke and Acts has a lot of material from Saul in it.
I suppose the interesting thing is that maybe, with the exception of Mark, the epistles are probably the earliest Christian texts, aren't they?
Yes, they are.
You know, Luke and Acts are probably, you know, they could be 2nd century when they were written.
Well, people normally say after AD 70, and that's important because why do they say that? They say that because there is a lot of material in the New Testament which comes out of Josephus Flavius. And that's a problem because it means that those texts must be written after AD 70. And so they have to make up this story that, oh, between the crucifixion of Jesus in AD 30 and AD 70, when these texts were written, there was 40 years of oral transmission for no good reason. Why oral transmission? Oh, because they couldn't write anything down. They were illiterate. Oh, don't be silly. You've only got to read Josephus to know how literate these people were. The reason why there's this 40-year gap in the text is because these events didn't happen until AD 70. And so they were written down immediately after they happened, but they didn't happen until AD 70. And that's a crucial thing you need to understand, because you can never find the basis of this story if you're looking in the AD 30s. It didn't happen then. The story happened in the AD 60s and in AD 70. And so we have this 40-year gap between the two. The reason for this is the Romans didn't want you to know that this was all talking about the Jewish revolt era. And we'll come on to that in a minute. I wonder if I've got I've got a nice graph here. So if I do a quick screen share.
Yeah.
And just pump that up. So that should be sharing now.
Got it. Timeline.
Yeah, timeline. This is by Lena Einhorn. So I wrote my book back in '97, including much of this material. But Lena Einhorn came up with this lovely graph, which displays this conundrum graphically. I'm making that too big, aren't I? Let me get a little bit smaller. And what you see is a whole load of similar events. So each color represents a similar event. And what we appear to have here is a duplication of events. So we've got a whole load of events you can see from the New Testament on the top row, which all cluster around the late AD 20s, AD 30, early AD 30s. So that's all from the New Testament. But if you go into real history, Josephus, all of those same events cluster up in the the AD 50s, AD 60s.
Wow, that's really
so there is a jump in the timeline where we seem to have a duplication of events. Why do we have that duplication? It's because the Romans have moved the timeline back again. Because they didn't want you to know that all of this gospel story was about the Jewish revolt. Because, well, you probably know that Jesus was a revolutionary. Everyone says, oh, yes, he was a revolutionary. But what they don't tell you is what revolution was he involved in. Okay. Well, give us a big revolution in the AD 30s. There wasn't one. AD 20s. This was all about the Jewish revolt, and this Jesus character was the leader of the Jewish revolt, which happened in the AD 60s. It was from AD 66 to AD 70. But the Romans didn't want you to know about this, and so they pushed his story back into the AD 20s in order to divorce it from real history. So Rome didn't want you to know that you could actually revolt against Rome. And so this was a propaganda exercise to remove this history from the Jewish revolt era. And we have lots of information from the New Testament that sort of gives us this idea. The only thing that ties the New Testament into the AD 20s is the mention of Pontius Pilate.
Oh, right, yeah.
Apart from that, there's nothing else. So we get things like Zacharias. So Matthew 23:35, Jesus is lamenting the death of Zacharias. He says, the righteous blood shed upon the earth like the blood of Zacharias, the son of Barachias, who you killed between the temple and the altar. Well, we know who this guy is, and a lot of people have said this. Even Adam Clarke, the famous theologian, from 1840. I think he was writing this back in the 19th century. Lots of people said, yeah, this is Zacharias Baruch or Zacharias Barachias. So in Jewish War, he says that Zacharias laughed at the zealots' pretended accusations. So the two of the boldest of them fell upon Zacharias in the middle of the temple and killed him. And he went down dead, and they mocked him, saying, "You have our verdict." Well, Adam Clarke says of this, some think that Jesus here refers to the spirit prophecy, he has to say it in that way, of the murder of Zacharias, son of Baruch, the one we've just been reading about. A rich Jew who was judged, condemned, and massacred in the middle of the temple by Idumean zealots, because this was a very particular death between the temple and the altar. Okay, so Jesus was talking here about Zacharias, son of Baruch. Trouble is, he is an AD 60s character. He was a leader of the Jewish revolt. That's a problem. We then have Jesus describing Jerusalem will be surrounded by a wall and a trench. That is a description of the Jewish revolt. That was the siege of Jerusalem, when Jerusalem was indeed surrounded by a wall and a trench. We have that from Josephus. And then we have the mention of Zizit ben Hakaseth. Now, I think I'm the first person to have really mentioned this, because I haven't seen any other historian mention this at all. But Jesus says to the multitude, the scribes and the Pharisees lay heavy burdens on men's shoulders. The people, he's meaning the aristocrats, enlarge their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels on their garments, and they love the uppermost rooms in the feasts and the chief seats in the synagogues, which again wouldn't mean very... In the synagogues, yeah. Which is odd, because I think they mean the temple, because they didn't really have synagogues, really.
No.
Yeah, although there was a synagogue over in Tiberias. We'll talk about that later. They always say there were no synagogues, but there was one in Tiberias. That sentence wouldn't really mean much to you if you hadn't have read the Talmud. And I think a lot of Christian scholars don't read the Talmud, which is the book of law within Judaism. And it says there, Ben Zizit Hakaseth was so called because his tassels used to trail on the cushions, as part of a section where they're making fun of this guy because he was too ostentatious. Pretty much the same as Jesus was, because his tassels trail on the cushions, just as Jesus was saying that they lengthen their tassels and they love the chief seats, the cushions in the synagogues. Jesus was making fun of the same person, and the name of the person is derived, it's a play on words with these things. Tassels is a zizith, and a seat or a cushion is a kiseth. And his name was Zizit ben Hakaseth. They're making fun of his name, as they always did in the Talmud. The trouble is, Jesus was making fun of this guy when this was one of the leaders of the Jewish revolt in the AD 60s. Again and again and again, we get these allusions to this being an AD 60s story. And the best one, I think, because it's more easy to understand, I think, is the one we get in Arthurian legend. I've got this big book on, you showed the cover of it in the start of this program. The Grail Cipher, it's a 600-page book on a revision of Arthurian legend. And people might say, well, what's Arthurian legend got to do with this? Well, the big hero of Arthurian legend is Joseph of Arimathea. He's a first century character, of course, out of the Gospels. Well, in Arthurian legend, they have a problem with this guy, because this is the guy that took Jesus down from the cross. Okay, so, Arthurian legend has to do the same. So they have Joseph of Arimathea taking Jesus down from the cross, and that would have been in AD 30. But then they have a problem because they say that Joseph of Arimathea was a knight, a soldier, working for Emperor Vespasian in the AD 70s. So what do? Well, they have to get him from one era to another one. So they say that after he took Jesus down from the cross in AD 30, he was imprisoned by the Romans. And in his prison, he went to sleep for 3 days. And he woke up 40 years later. And suddenly he was in the AD 70s. And now he can be a knight working for Emperor Vespasian. You see what this, I call it the chronological chasm, does. Anything that touches on the gospel story has a problem with this chasm, because classical Christianity has placed this story in the AD 20s and AD 30, when it actually belongs in AD 60, AD 70. And so they have to move Joseph of Arimathea 40 years into the late AD 60s, AD 70, so he can be working for Emperor Vespasian. And that's interesting, because who was the guy in AD 70 who took the leader of the Jewish revolt down from the cross? That was Josephus Flavius. That's tricky. So if you read the biography of Josephus Flavius, Josephus Flavius, we haven't been through who he is at present, but we should do that. He was a Judean army commander that when he was fighting the Romans during the Jewish revolt, he changed sides and became a Roman. So now he's working for the Romans. After the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of Jerusalem, he was on his way back from Tekoa, which is the south of Jerusalem, and he came across the 3 leaders of the Jewish revolt being crucified. So we have 3 revolutionary leaders being crucified by the Romans after a revolt. And he's a bit aghast at this, and they were his former compatriots. So he goes to the governor and gets permission to take them down early. They were taken down early, given medical treatment. 2 of them died, and 1 of them survived. Familiar story?
Yeah, I think I know where this is going.
Yeah, this is the crucifixion story. But the trouble is, this happened in AD 70, not in AD 30, as a result of the Jewish revolt. Now, who took him down from the cross? Well, in the biblical story, it was Joseph of Arimathea. Now, in this story, real history, it was Josephus Bar Matthias. Arimatheus, Bar Matthias.
Oh, so was that his name before he adopted Flavius?
His father's name, yeah, because that was only an adopted name from the emperor. His name before that was Bar Matthias.
Wow. Now,
So
Bar would mean son of, wouldn't it?
He was. His father was called, his father was Matthias.
And then
his brother was Matthias as well.
Right.
That's a problem, because it sort of is indicating that Joseph of Arimathea, who's this obviously well-known character, because he suddenly appears in the story without introduction, a bit like sort of Richard I coming back from the Crusades at the end of Robin Hood, and this king suddenly comes into the last scene in the film, and you're supposed to know who he is. You know, I'm Richard I. Well, he does exactly the same in the gospel story. You know, he suddenly appears at the end of the story, and everyone's supposed to know who he is, and he has sufficient authority to take this guy down from the cross who had, been crucified by the Romans. So he comes down and pulls him down from the cross. Well, that's exactly what Josephus Flavius did. And he had that authority because he was a Roman army commander, and he had the ear of who was now the emperor, Emperor Vespasian.
So he wasn't based at the court in Rome. He was on the ground in Judea as the revolt was being put down by Titus.
Oh, yes. Yeah, he had been in Rome in the AD 60s,
Right.
but he had returned. He had returned to Judea in about AD 64 or something, 65.
Got you.
Perhaps we ought to go through who he was, actually.
Yeah.
Because this is a bit
controversial, Ralph.
Yeah, a bit interesting as well. We must go through the parable of the vineyard owner. I'm just going to have to do a search term. I've got so many notes nowadays. My notes are more like a encyclopedia than they are notes, which is always good fun. But anyway, yeah. So, who was Saul is the big question. And funnily enough, this is the first thing I solved. So I solved this back in the early 1990s, late 88, 1980s, before I'd even written a book. So this didn't come out in print until 97.
Okay.
With my Jesus Last of the Pharaohs book. As soon as I read both of these books together, and I'm not the first person to have seen this, because every large, wealthy household would have had a Bible on their bookshelf, and next door to it, they would have had the works of Josephus, because the two complement each other. And, the English translation of Josephus was out by William Whiston. He's got to be 18th century, so it's been out there a long time. So anyone reading the New Testament and Josephus would have seen this similarity, but they wouldn't have accepted it because they didn't want to accept it. So they probably just turned the other page and carried on as if nothing had happened. So who is Saul? Because this is the guy who created Christianity. We've already been through this, He was the apostle to the Gentiles, who created simple Judaism, which we know as Christianity, and yet nobody knows who Saul is. It's a bit odd that the guy who created Christianity has gone missing from from real history. So who was he? The only way we can find out who he was is by a comparison of two people. So both of these people, Saul and the guy I'm linking him with, they were both Jews. They were both raised in Jerusalem. They both had Roman citizenship. That's odd because not many Jews had Roman citizenship. Both educated as Pharisees. They both became rabbis. They both preferred short hair. We've already talked about the Nazarene always having long hair, which is why Jesus is always portrayed with long hair. Both of these people preferred short hair. Saul even says, does nature not teach you that long hair is shameful on a man? So he was not being classical Judaic, even though he was supposed to be a Jew. That comes from 1 Corinthians 11:14, I think, on that one. Both were working with the Jerusalem authorities against the Jewish revolutionaries. We'll come back to that in a minute. Both had a vision of a man and changed sides. So they had a flash of inspiration and changed sides. They both traveled widely in Europe and returned to Jerusalem. They were both very controversial characters. And I think more importantly, both of them were on the same prison ship sailing to Rome to go and see Nero. So this was a prison ship leaving from Caesarea. It was called the Castor and Pollux. So they even had ship names in those days. And it was shipwrecked on Malta. So both of these people were shipwrecked on Malta. That was interesting.
So just quickly, Caesarea. Where's that?
Oh, Caesarea is just on the coast of Judea. It was the big port
Jewish
city.
port. Yeah.
Yeah. So they were both shipwrecked on Malta, and so they both had to swim for their lives onto Malta, and then later on the next season they were taken to Naples, where they went to see Nero. Now, what's the chances of these two people being on the same shipwreck in this era? And they both wrote many letters around Jewish communities around Europe, and they both had the same publisher, Epaphroditus, who was also the scribe for Emperor Nero as well. Epaphroditus was the guy who killed Nero. So yeah, lots of interesting.
Sorry, you make me want to interrupt every 10 seconds. So Nero didn't commit suicide then, did he not?
He was helped.
Oh, okay, that's it.
He could not do it himself, so Epaphroditus was his scribe, and he did it for him.
Got you.
And it could well be the same Epaphroditus that was actually the scribe working for Saul and for this other guy. So who was the other guy who mimics Saul so closely? That was Josephus Flavius. Now that's interesting, because nobody would want Josephus Flavius as being the main author of the biblical stories, because Josephus Flavius was just an atrocious person. He was the greatest narcissist there's probably ever been. He was a complete egotist. There was only one thing and one person that was important to Josephus, and that was Josephus. So nobody would want Josephus to be the main author of the gospel story. And people have said, no, it can't have been, because Josephus was born too late. He was not born until AD 37. So how can he be on these evangelical tours in AD 52? Well, of course he could, because you go through your bar mitzvah at age 14 and you're a man. So you can get married, you can have a career, a wife, and everything else. And who do you choose to go on evangelical tours? As I always say, if you get a knock on the door and there's a couple of Mormons there, you don't get a couple of old geezers, you get a couple of youngsters. And if they knock on my door, I don't shut the door in their face, because that would be rude. No, I open the door and I let them in, and I close the door behind them. And then I've got them for the next 2 hours. Until they're clambering to get out of the door, let me out. But anyway, yeah, that's what you get. If you get a couple of evangelists come around, you get a couple of youngsters, because you can't do this later in life, when you've got a family and a wife and a house and God knows what. So you send out the youngsters to do this job. So yes, sure, Saul could be Josephus in terms of age, but in terms of explaining what was going on, this is very explanatory, because how was Saul, I wonder if I've got a quote here. How was Saul sending people to prison? Let's see if I've got a quote for you. Yeah, Saul says, Saul made havoc on the church, entering into every house and committing them to prison. I persecuted them unto death, binding and delivering men and women into prison. How was Saul doing that? Saul was supposed to be a tent maker. How does Saul arrest people, put them in prison, and execute them? Tricky, that, It almost sounds like he was the chief of police. Well, if he was Josephus Flavius, we know exactly how he was doing that, because Josephus Flavius was the chief of police in command of Galilee. So after his little escapade down in Rome, when he went to see Nero on this ship, he was there for a couple of years or more, came back to Judea in AD 65, just as the Jewish revolt was breaking out. And as soon as the Jewish revolt broke out, there was no Roman command anymore in that region. And so the authorities in Jerusalem appointed commanders to be in command of each region. And Josephus Flavius became the army commander in command of Galilee. And as the army commander, what was he doing there? He was chasing a guy called Jesus around Galilee. This comes from real history. He was chasing this guy called Jesus around Galilee. Now, what was Saul doing? Yeah, he was chasing a guy called Jesus all around Galilee. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? So it's exactly the same. So this becomes explanatory. Now we know how Saul could imprison these people. He was Josephus Flavius. That was his job. And that's exactly what he was doing. He was persecuting this guy called Jesus, Jesus of Gamala Saphias. And interestingly, this guy called Jesus, this is from AD 66, AD 67. This guy called Jesus was the rebel leader of 600 rebel fishermen. Now, who was the leader of rebel fishermen in this era? You know, it all begins to tie in together, which is why I like this explanation, because it's not an explanation in isolation. There's a lot of reasons for suspecting that it might be true. So I've got some. We can have a look at a few images. Let me do a quick screen share. So if I take that and share that.
Oh.
Yeah, that's just a picture on a church of the, this is the shipwreck. This is the shipwreck of Saul. I just thought it was a nice image of the shipwreck. It's fairly famous within the biblical text. That is also, although you can't see it, let me make it a bit bigger. That's the shipwreck again. Yeah. This I thought was interesting. This was Saul having his flash of inspiration. This comes from Germany. This is a church in Germany. I just thought it was interesting that they dressed Saul as a Roman army commander, as a soldier. Which he was. If he was Josephus Flavius, he was a soldier in command of Galilee. So I thought that was interesting. This is Josephus, if people don't know who he is. The museum that holds this bust says, no, it's not Josephus, because it has no attribution on it, but everyone takes this as being an image of Josephus, because he would have been clean shaven in the Roman fashion. So this was unusual for a Jewish guy to be clean shaven. That's why a lot of people think this is Josephus Flavius. But I was going to quickly just jump onto this, because we were talking about Galilee. I don't know if you know, but the primary symbol of Nazarene Judaism was the Zodiac.
Right. Okay.
So the primary symbol of Judaism is the Zodiac, and a lot of people don't know that because it's not widely discussed. And this comes from a synagogue. We were talking about synagogues. This comes from the Sea of Galilee, just below Tiberias. And it's a marvelous Zodiac. This is like about 5 meters across, so it's huge, it's large. And it's Judaic. You can see it's all in Aramaic. And above, in the register above, there is the Temple of Jerusalem and the Ark of the Covenant and the shofar and all sorts of other things. So this is most definitely a synagogue. Wow. But the primary symbol in the synagogue is the zodiac. And worse than that, the primary symbol in the zodiac is Helios, the Greek sun god. What's he doing in a Jewish synagogue? I mean, you can't have images of animals anyway, let alone the Greek Helios. This is how radical Nazarene Judaism was. It was not classical Judaism. And in fact, we have a paragraph from Josephus Flavius saying that he was sent by the Jewish authorities to destroy this zodiac because it had blasphemous images of animals in this palace, he calls it. And it's quite obviously because he was sent to a palace that was 4 furlongs south of Tiberias. And if you go 4 furlongs south of Tiberias, you come to this place on the Sea of Galilee. So it's quite obvious he was...
Create no graven or molten images.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a
within
dozen of them.
Judaism.
Yeah.
Well, that's in Christianity as well. And of course, in Christianity, we tend to ignore it in Christianity too. But very unusual in a synagogue to have ignored that first commandment. Because I think it is, I think it's the first. No, the first one is, you shall not have any other gods but me.
Yeah.
Which means probably there are other gods, otherwise you wouldn't exclude them. Anyway, I think the second or third one is no graven images. So.
Who are the guys in the corner there, Ralph? There's one at the bottom left.
They are the seasons. Yeah, right. They're the seasons. So that I think this one is spring over here, and this one's
autumn, maybe.
No, that must be autumn. This must be winter, because this is the fruits of
spring will be
harvest.
top right, because it'll be that's February, March, top right, so that'll be spring.
But do remember, this is a processional zodiac. This turns backwards.
Oh, right.
A lot of people been confused by that. It goes backwards. It's anti-clockwise. So that's because it's a processional zodiac, and a processional zodiac actually gives us a date. I presume your listeners will be familiar with procession, will they?
Definitely.
Yeah. So this is indicating the great months, and each great month is 2,000 years long. So you can see that the head of Helios is pointing at the join between Aries and Pisces.
Entering the age of Pisces. Wow.
So it gives us a date. Yeah, it gives us a date. And Jesus was the first king of Pisces, the first of the fisher kings.
Exactly, yeah.
So it gives us a date of 1st century.
Oh, that's wild. I love it. What a
and
find.
Better than that, if we do a quick zoom in, you'll see that Helios is holding a sort of blue-green
disco ball,
spherical Earth.
Oh, yeah.
He's holding the Earth in his gravitational grasp, and you can see it's got lines of latitude and longitude that are curved. So this is a sphere.
Yeah.
So this was long before Copernicus, and they knew all about it, and they knew the heliocentric model of the universe, of the solar system. This was the level of knowledge they had within the Nazarene Church. So that's always interesting. There were lots of these. This is the one at Sepphoris. More difficult to see because it's broken, but you can see Helios is in the center there. And it's got the sun and the moon in this one. You can just about see sun and moon. And then the zodiac characters around the outside.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic.
So these were quite common. This one's interesting because this is a Christian one. This comes from the 6th century, again on the Sea of Galilee, at Bet Shean, which is just on the south end of the Sea of Galilee. And this one comes from a Christian monastery. And so they've adapted this, so it's no longer signs of the zodiac, it's men
Saints.
as months of the year.
Right.
So you can see it's all in Greek. So down on the left here, you can see Aprilos, Maios, Junios. And then on the right, we've got Octobrios, Novembros, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So exactly the same as we use today, the same months. But of course, remember the months and the signs of the zodiac go round together.
Was this a
So if you,
Christian one, Ralph? Are those
yeah, this is
depictions
Christian.
of
This is in a
apostles
monastery.
then, do you think?
Well, yes, you're ahead of me there.
Oh, sorry.
So who was the man and the woman surrounded by 12 disciples?
Is it Jesus and Mary Magdalene?
Yeah,
Oh.
but that's interesting in a church, isn't it? In a monastery.
Well, yeah, it'd be
They've
heresy.
got absolutely. They've got Jesus and Mary as the sun and the moon. You can see he's got the spikes of the sun, and she's got the moon
Sacred
on
feminine.
her head. And yeah, so this is Jesus and Mary surrounded by the 12 disciples.
Wow.
Who are representative of the signs of the zodiac. That's why there are 12 disciples. That's why there were 12 houses of the sons of Judah. The 12 houses of Judaism. It's all to do with the zodiac.
Great stuff.
And we can take this further because we have exactly the same in Arthurian legend. It's probably too early to go on to this because I've got a whole book on Arthurian legend. But this is the Round Table of Arthur in Winchester. I don't know if you've been to see it. It's well worth seeing, actually. It's a very good. So this is very old. This is like 800 years old, this table, and they've put it up on the wall there so you can see it. But if you read Arthurian legend, this is not a round table. This is a zodiac. Because the Round Table of Arthur was based on the Last Supper table of Jesus. And it specifically says there were 3 tables that were made. There was the Last Supper table of Jesus, which was round. It wasn't rectangular like Leonardo drew it, with the 12 disciples around it. And then there was the round table of Joseph of Arimathea. He had his own round table. And then there was the round table of King Arthur and his 12 knights. So the knights of the round table and the disciples of Jesus are exactly the same. And remember that the disciples of Jesus were all armed. Jesus told them to go out and buy swords. So they were all armed. And so, yeah, this is the Last Supper table. But the Last Supper table, as we've just seen previously, the Last Supper table was a zodiac. So this, I think, was the Last Supper table. Because remember, in this era, in this sort of region, they didn't sit at tables. They didn't have tables. That's a very sort of, Northern European habit. Down in this part of the world, you sat on the floor, like you do if you go out to Iran or Iraq or Pakistan or something. You sit on the floor on a cushion. This is why Zizit ben Hakasith had cushions, big cushions. So I think this was the Last Supper table. What would happen is that the disciples would all be linked to a particular sign of the zodiac, and they would bring their cushions and sit at this table, and this is where they would eat. And the Jesus character, here's the Jesus character, would sit in the center. So he would literally sit in the center of the table, unlike the Winchester one, where they've managed to jam the king on the top. No, he would have actually sat in the center of the Last Supper table, because it was not only a table, it was instruction. You could actually instruct the disciples how procession worked, how the signs of the zodiac changed, how to do prophecy, maybe, from the changing signs of the zodiac. Why Jesus was the first of the Fisher Kings, the Arthurian Fisher Kings, because he was the first king of Pisces. And this is also why King Arthur became, well, I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit, but I can give you a bit of a tantalize. Why not? This is a standard zodiac, and you can see in the center of the zodiac, there is the sun. That's fairly standard. Sun is at the center of the solar system. But if you stand on the earth and look up at the night sky, you might see this instead. which is the signs of the zodiac, and in the center we have Ursa Major, which is known as the Great Bear, Arcturus, from which we get King Arthur. Yeah. So Arthur was also the guy who sat at the center of the table, just like the Jesus character sat at the center of the table, because he was Arcturus. He was the Great Bear, surrounded by his 12 knights of the Round Table. So yeah, that's a little extra bonus. Yeah.
Cool.
Nice.
Yes. So anything else before we move on to another topic?
No, I was going to say, because we've blown over time. We've already gone like an hour and 15, Ralph. And
I haven't even started yet.
I know. Didn't you do like an 11-hour stream once?
Yes. Well, actually, the longest we did was 5.5 hours, and then he stuck 2 of those together and made 11.
Wow.
I mean, there's just so much to go into. I don't want to.
Well, you can break it up. Do you do pre-record? Because you can break it up later if you want.
Well, I would like to, do an episode just on Arthurian stuff at some point in the future.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
we haven't finished on Jesus yet.
That's what I mean. Do we need to? What do we need to do? Can we wrap up the Jesus stuff like fairly quickly, or would that be doing it a disservice?
Yeah, I could wrap it up in the next 50 minutes if you want.
I was thinking like 10. Is that even possible?
Well, sort of, a little bit.
No.
And any questions from the floor, maybe? Anything that's not clear, perhaps, first?
I'm happy. I think we've got, the timeline is skewed. It's 30 years too early. Flavius Josephus is Paul, the apostle, Paul the evangelist. I think they're the 2 big takeaways for me.
Yeah. Oh, well, just to finish it off, if you want to finish it off in 10 minutes, the parable that knits all of this together is probably the parable of the vineyard owner. So let me stop sharing, because we don't need to share anymore.
Okay.
There we go. Back again. What was this all about? We were talking about the Jewish revolt and how Jesus was a leader of the Jewish revolt. What was that revolt about? Well, if you look in a classical history book, they'll say basically it was an internal domestic dispute within Judea, nothing to do with anything else, honest, really. I don't believe that's true. I think this was a revolt against Rome, and that's why they ended up with a crucifixion, because he was going against Rome. Remember, this had just happened 6 years before. I'm just trying to remember when the Druids revolt. So they had the Druids revolt in Britain in the early AD 60s,
right,
which resulted because they went to Anglesey and they destroyed all of the Druids, and then they came back and they had the Essene uprising, and the Essene went around and destroyed like 4 or 5 Roman cities completely.
Yeah,
absolute mayhem in the country.
Boudica.
And yeah, with Boudica, and Rome didn't want that, so they had that in the back of their mind, and so they wanted a political result as well as a military result, because they'd already had this big defeat in Britannia. So that's what the story was all about. I think it was more of a revolt against Rome than something in domestic.
I mean,
and we get this.
Sorry, Ralph. I mean, it's kind of opportunistic as well, because we've just had the year of 4 emperors in 69. We've had loads of infighting within Rome. It was perfect time to sort of stage an uprising, wasn't it? In this time period,
it was absolutely. I mean, by AD 66, everybody knew that Nero was a dead man walking, and he was put out of his misery by Epaphroditus in AD 68. Who might have been Saul and Josephus publisher, yeah. Yeah, absolute perfect timing. The throne of Rome was empty. It was open to whoever had the largest treasury and the largest army could march into Rome and take it, which is effectively what Vespasian did in the end, of course. So then we come to the parable of the vineyard owner, which is from the Gospels. This is Matthew 21:33. I think there's a repetition of this in Mark as well. It says there was a Lord who planted a vineyard. So Jesus, this is from the mouth of Jesus. There was a Lord who planted a vineyard and let it out to a tenant and went to a far country. And when the harvest drew near, he sent his servants to the tenant so he might receive his rent. But the tenant took the servants and beat one and killed another and stoned another. So when the Lord, therefore, of the vineyard comes, what will he do to these tenants? He will miserably destroy those wicked men and let out his vineyard to another tenant who will pay their rent on time. So this is Jesus, the man of the people, in his cloak and his sandals, and he's upholding the right of absentee landlords to kill their tenant if they don't pay their rent on time. What does this have to do with the classical Jesus? And it's quite fun to read the sort of classical interpretations of this, from the church, because they spin this in all sorts of different fashions to try and get around it. But it's quite obvious what it's talking about. This is the AD 60s. So all we need to do in order to understand this is change the Lord is the king of Edessa, because Jesus was the king of Edessa. We've not even been into that, actually. Why was Jesus the king of Edessa? So the Lord was the king of Edessa. The vineyard was Judea and Syria, and the tenant was the Romans. And the thing is, of course, that the Edessans owned these lands. It was their land. It was their vineyard, and the Romans were on it. So if we make those slight adjustments and read that again, it becomes, there was an Edessan king who had lands in Judea. Yes, Queen Helena was the queen of Judea, and let it out to the Romans and went to a far country. Yes, he went back to Edessa. And when the harvest drew near, he sent his servants to the Romans that he might receive his rent for his lands. But the Romans took his servants and beat one and killed another and stoned another. So when the Edessan king of these lands comes, what will he do to these Romans? He will miserably destroy these wicked Romans and let out his lands to another tenant who will pay their rent on time. This is what it was about. This was a tax dispute and a land dispute, because the Romans were on Edessan lands. They considered to be these lands to be theirs. And not only were the Romans not paying their rent to Edessa, they were demanding rent from the Edessans. These were the worst tenants in the world. These were tenants who actually demanded rent from the landlord. And that's what this parable is actually talking about. This was the dispute that caused the Jewish revolt. And just to finish up, because we've not really been into why Jesus was the king of Edessa, but there are quite a lot of reasons. The king of Edessa at this time was called King Esus Manu, the sixth of Edessa. And Jesus's name was King Jesus Emmanuel.
Pretty close.
Of Judea. But remember, this king of Edessa was the king of Judea as well. So that explains this.
Was this the coin?
Yes, I was just going to display the coin. So, but also I was going to have a quick look at the verse. Anyway, there's a verse at the beginning of Matthew that says there was a prophecy that Jesus will be called Emmanuel. But that prophecy is meaningless, because Jesus was never called Emmanuel throughout the whole of the New Testament. So what's that prophecy talking about? Well, it's just a little hint for those people who had been initiated, who were in the know, that the Jesus character was called Emmanuel, And you would only ever understand that if you knew Edessan history, where the king of Edessa was called Manu, Emmanuel. So the prophecy was just a confirmation for people in the know that this was the Jesus character. And of course, when Jesus was crucified, he was crucified while wearing a purple cloak and a crown of thorns. Now, the purple cloak is the symbol of the emperor. You don't dress up in Rome in a purple cloak if you don't want to be executed. So by putting a purple cloak on Jesus when he was crucified is indicating that he was a pretender for the throne of Rome. And this is exactly what the Jewish revolt was about. They didn't want to just take over Judea. This was a stepping stone to taking over the whole of the Roman Empire. And that was the goal of these Edessan kings. They obviously lost in the end, and it was Vespasian who went to Rome to become emperor. But he was also crucified while wearing and I'll just do a quick share, a crown of thorns.
Bang. There it is.
There we go. And of course, all of the Edessan kings wore a crown of thorns. And this is the standard crown of thorns that all of the Edessan kings wore for about 300 years. And as you can see here, he has a domed sort of bishop's mitre, you might call it, which is covered in thorns or some sort of spikes. We don't quite know what the spikes are, but he is wearing a crown of thorns. So it's not the standard bunch of brambles that they will put on it because they want to try and persuade you that Jesus was a pauper prince of peace, but he was nothing of the sort. No, the crown of thorns was a proper papal sort of mitre, a royal mitre, covered in thorns.
Is there any textual references to Edessan kings wearing crowns of thorns, or just this visual one?
Just the visual one, although we have loads of these coins. So we have hundreds and hundreds of these coins. So
of the same king or different kings?
No, of different kings.
Okay.
But they all have, apart from Wael, who's the only king who doesn't wear the crown of thorns. Right. But this goes right back into the very early days of Edessa, right back to the 1st century. We have coins of them wearing a crown of thorns.
Cool.
So this was a big, long tradition. And we don't know what the thorns were. We don't know what this signifies. So it's a matter of guesswork. I was wondering if they might be feathers from the phoenix, because the phoenix was intimately connected somehow with this shape, this domed shape of the Elagabal. Yeah, but we don't exactly know why it has thorns. So, yeah, this was the goal of the Jesus character. He wanted to become the emperor of Rome. That was the reason for the Jewish revolt. And effectively, that Jewish revolt became the last battle in the year of 4 emperors that you were talking about. So in 1 year, 4 emperors came and went. They all threw their hat into the ring, wanting to be emperor. They all came along with their armies, and they were all defeated by someone else. And then we came to the last battle. So it wasn't the year of 4 emperors. It was the year of 5 emperors. And the last battle was between Vespasian, who was only a commander at that point, Commander Vespasian, and Jesus, King Esus Manu of Edessa, the Jesus character. And they had this almighty battle in Judea and in Jerusalem, not for the throne of Jerusalem, but for the throne of Rome. And whoever won this battle was going to sail to Rome as the next emperor. And of course, King Esus lost that battle, and it was Vespasian who sailed to Rome as the next emperor. But if Jesus had won this battle, then it would have been Emperor Jesus, would have been the next emperor of Rome. So we would have had a Nazarene Jewish emperor of Rome.
Hence Vespasian patronizing Josephus to write this guy out of history.
Precisely, yeah. So Josephus Flavius became the scribe, the pet Jew of Vespasian, who wrote this story. And of course, Vespasian said, as you just said there, write this guy out of history. Include him if you want, because what Vespasian wanted is, because of the uprising in Britain with the Druids, he knew that a military solution was not the full solution. What he wanted to do was to neuter Messianic Nazarene Judaism. How do you do that? You destroy the basis of their religion. How do you do that? Well, you promote a Rome-friendly form of Judaism. And that was the simple Judaism of Saul, which he already had in the bag, because Saul had been promoting this for the last 20 years. So they already had that. So he said, right, okay, you go off and promote that, because it's a Rome-friendly form of Judaism. Turn the other cheek. Render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, pay your Roman taxes. It was just beautiful. Vespasian loved it. But whatever you do, don't say that this hero guy was involved in the Jewish revolt. Stick him back in the AD 30s, and then nobody will know that he was a leader of the Jewish revolt. And that simple technique of just taking him out of that era has fooled everybody for 2,000 years. And that's the real story. That's what actually happened.
Well,
mic drop.
Yeah, exactly. Massive, cavernous.
So it's funny. It's the same story. Nothing in the story changes. But you see what I mean about the context changing.
Absolutely.
So it's funny because, I could go to a Christian and say, look, I've proved the whole of your New Testament is correct. And they'll say, get out of here. We don't want you. Because my version of the New Testament has changed the story. So that the Jesus character is now a real king, a warrior king, tried to take over the Roman Empire and failed. But the story is exactly the same. Nothing changes.
Well,
so
Ralph,
there we go. But it took me a long time to find that. That was 30 years of research.
Yeah. Well, it's been fantastic, Ralph. People should buy your books, edfoodbooks.uk. The link will be in the show notes.
Yeah, this mainly comes from Jesus, King of Edessa, this particular one, but it was built up. We haven't been through the build-up yet as to how we got there. Cleopatra to Christ, that Jesus was a great-grandson of Queen Cleopatra. So we've not been through that. King Jesus, why the guy was a real king. And then Jesus, King of Edessa. So that's the Edessan story, why he ended up in Edessa.
Oh, sorry, just quickly, because otherwise it's going to do it. Cleopatra's children with whom?
With Caesar.
Oh, great. So, right. So JC and JC are related.
Yeah, there was a lost, JC and JC, yeah. There was a lost daughter of Cleopatra from 44 BC. When Caesar was killed on the Ides of March, Cleopatra was pregnant. We have that from Cicero. And Cicero is really worried that they'll get a scion of Caesar, an heir of Caesar, to be the next emperor of Rome. And he doesn't want that. He doesn't want an Egyptian emperor. But, moving on 3 or 4 months, and suddenly he's happy. There's no problem. So why is there no problem? Well, either there was a miscarriage, because Cicero wanted a miscarriage. So either there was a miscarriage, or the child was a daughter. And I think there was a lost daughter that we don't really know much about. And I go through the history of that lost daughter, who ends up as the Queen of Parthia. So she ends up with this is brushing through it very, very quickly. She ends up as the Queen of Parthia. Her name is Queen Thea Musa Aurania, who became the Queen of Parthia. And she was kicked out of Parthia in AD 4 and ended up back in Syria. And
marrying an Edessan king.
Yeah, well, let me very quickly just show you a quick image. Yeah, she married an Edessan king. Sort of thing.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, gosh.
Let me show you a quick picture. This is the lady, because this lady's gone missing from history as well. Again, nobody knows about this lady. On the left, we have Queen Cleopatra, Cleopatra the Seventh, the famous queen of Egypt. On the right, we have Queen Thea Musa Aurania, Queen of Parthia, who was kicked out of Parthia in AD 4. And I think there's a family likeness there with that sort of small mouth and receding chin. I think there's a bit of a family likeness there. So lady on the left would have been the mother. Lady on the right is the daughter. And she would have been the lost daughter of Queen Cleopatra. And that's why she became the Queen of Parthia, because she was so famous. Josephus Flavius says that he sent, this was Emperor Augustus, sent a concubine, a prostitute, to the king of Parthia as a diplomatic gift. And of course, that's not going to work.
Yeah, but how would Augustus have treated a rival to the throne? You know, a daughter of Cleopatra.
Well, they used them
Sex slave.
as
Ship her off.
Yeah. Well, they did exactly the same to Yuba the First.
Right.
Yuba the First was the king of North Africa, Mauritania, and he gave him the other daughter of Cleopatra, Cleopatra Selene, and he shipped Cleopatra Selene off to North Africa as a diplomatic bride. This is what they did, you know. They were chattels; they weren't princesses so much. And he did very well. So he got a daughter of Cleopatra. He got an incarnation of Isis. So he was very pleased by this. But then to Phraates IV, who was the king of Parthia, Emperor Augustus, gave the king of Parthia a courtesan, Thermusa, who is Thea Musa Aurania. And everyone thought this was a ribald old tale that Josephus had just made this up, because there's stories of incest and God knows what goes on with it. And she poisoned her husband, so she killed the king. But you know, everyone disbelieved Josephus. But then in the end, they started finding these coins. And this is Thea Musa Aurania. This is the queen on the right, the only queen there's ever been of Parthia and Persia. And on the left is her son. This is Phraates. And these are the two people who were kicked out of Parthia and went to Syria. And these are the two people who founded Edessa as an independent principality.
Wow.
So Josephus calls these the Babylonian Jews from beyond the Euphrates, because they did come from beyond the Euphrates and they were Jewish in the end. Yes, so we've got evidence for that. We haven't been through the Hakok mosaic either, so there's lots of stuff to go through.
Well, you're gonna have to come back. And I've been looking in the chat, and people have been loving this and saying you've got to get Ralph back. Got to get Ralph back. We'll not leave it as long this time, Ralph.
No.
Yeah, we can do another one. There's lots to talk about before we go on to Arthur.
Yeah.
Or we could go on to Arthur anyway, you know, because people always like the Arthurian story, but there's lots to talk about.
Yeah. Well, this has been fantastic. And like I said, links are in the show notes. If you want to check out Ralph's work, buy his books and gen up on all this in much greater detail at your leisure, follow the link in the show notes. And yeah, thanks. It's been really great talking with you again, Ralph. Thanks for coming.
My pleasure. Hope everyone enjoyed it.
I'm sure they did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've had lots of good feedback. I've just been looking at the chat periodically as we've been going. And yeah, fantastic. And yeah, hope to see you again before too long.
Indeed. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Ralph.
Thanks, Ralph.
Take care. Have a nice rest of your Sunday.
Cheers.
All right. We'll be back in, 10 minutes, 5-10 minutes, do some news. And so we'll see you on the other side, folks. Take care.